So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the effective soil management webinar that we're running at Basis. My name's Greg Hopkinson, and I'm Head of Business Development, and I just want to say thanks for everyone joining today. So it's going to be about 45 minutes to an hour, just a bit of housekeeping before we start. We've got two speakers today, and we'll do a Q&A panel at the end. So if anything comes up about what I talk about regards to Basis or questions that's based on the speakers kind of presentations, then we'll do all those questions at the end. I just asked if you put your questions into the Q&A box, so there should be a little kind of speech marks icon on your page somewhere. And if you can just put your questions into that, then we'll cover them all at the end. The other thing to do is, obviously, you've all registered for this webinar and put your 200 number in, but sometimes, depending on how your Teams works, whether it's through the browser or through your an app on your desktop, then sometimes we don't pick up your emails and things like that to match it all up. So if you have kind of signed up through your web browser, then please just put your 200 number, your Basis 200 number into the Q&A box, and we'll get a point assigned to your account once the webinar's finished today. And I think that's all the kind of housekeeping stuff. We are having some slight technical issues getting one of our speakers online, as we have had in the past with Teams. Wonderful technology. We are looking forward to doing some meetings face to face when you don't have this issue as much. But hopefully, while our first speaker's talking today, we'll be able to get that issue resolved and get them online, and we'll have a full complement today. So I've just got a few slides I wanted to go through just to introduce the webinar today. So firstly, why are we doing a presentation and a webinar today about soils? And I really like this. I've actually used this in a previous webinar we've done. This is from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, and it looks at all the different kind of functions that soils deliver for us, what they provide as a society, and as we like to say, kind of ecosystem services. And as you can see, quite a small part of that is provision of food, fibre and fuel. I think that little segment could be a bit larger potentially, but it also shows all the other fantastic kind of services soils providers. And I'll not go through all of them, but some of the ones you'll definitely think of are definitely climate regulation at the minute. It's never been kind of more pertinent and important, and going to be in the future. Also nutrient cycling, and we'll all know that kind of from facts qualifications and soil and water about how we cycle or recycle organic manures and other organic materials through our soils. And then finally, kind of flood regulation, and I think that's such a massive important one. Is another thing that's going to be a focus as kind of the climate changes and weather patterns change. So that's why we want to focus on soils today, and why we focus on soils so much in a lot of Basis courses. So another reason that we wanted to do a webinar focused on soil management today was we've actually recently done an update on the soil and water management course, and information on this is available on the Basis website in the news article, and for our members it's all been in the newsletter as well that's recently been sent out this week. And I just wanted to run through a few of the changes that we've made to update the course. So firstly, we wanted to look at really soil assessments and preventing soil compaction, and if necessary alleviating soil compaction, how you do an assessment, how you do a soil management plan. And there's been a real increase on the focus on that side of it, and the practical elements of doing it, getting out there, assessing soil, because that's got to be kind of the start of soil management. We've also done an updated section on the cultivations. Understanding cultivation strategies has always been a key part of the soil and water management certificate, but we felt that there's been a real update in technology, in thinking, in knowledge in this area, in the systems that people are using, and we've updated the syllabus and the exam to match those. And it's also looking at climate change and carbon sequestration. There's been increased focus on that as it comes to light that kind of how we manage soils is going to be an imperative part of how we meet the targets of to become a net zero industry by 2030 ideally. We've also looked at kind of the overlap with some of our other courses, and based on kind of industry and candidate feedback, it was felt that there was probably a bit too much overlap with the FACS qualification. So we've reduced that, and we've focused much more on soil and water management as a key part of it, and manure applications and using organic materials, and less focus on doing a nutrient management plan and actually calculating the requirements for manufactured fertilizers. But it does just show why we always recommend doing the FACS course before you do soil and water management. It does give that real understanding, and now we don't cover it as much. There's less overlap. That's never been more important. And then finally, this is true for all our courses. Updates on legislation, especially following us leaving the EU, is essential. So we've kind of updated that as well. And we've also restructured the modules on soil and water management. So it's now 7 modules, and we think we've expanded them a little bit and segmented the course a little bit more. So it should be a bit more intuitive for candidates going through it. And finally, we've also updated the exam. So we've split it over 2 days, while before it was often carried out over one very packed day, quite often in winter, where it was a lack of light and bad weather made it always difficult. So we've now got day 1, which is going to be the written parts with 20 multiple choice questions and a farm management plan. And this is a slight change. It's removed the short answer questions, and we felt that there was too much overlap basically between the farm management plan and the short answer questions. We had candidates answering the same kind of topics or the same areas of the syllabus twice, so we wanted to avoid that. So that's one update. And then moving the Vivas, which is still an important part, and we can't wait to get the soil and water management Vivas back out in the field when we can, and following kind of current guidance. And we've actually extended the Vivas, especially the one with the soil expert in a soil pit. And that's based on feedback from candidates, what they felt was most beneficial for them. That's what they loved doing as part of the assessment. And yeah, we really think this is kind of a better all-round assessment process for it. Now, if anyone's got any questions about that, we'll cover that at the end. Like I say, put it more in the Q&A for the Q&A panel that I'll be providing at the end. But hopefully we've got 2 speakers today. We've definitely got 1, and unfortunately Jane's going first. So Jane's going to give me a bit of time now, give me 20 minutes or so to get Philip online. But Jane is from Cranfield University, and Jane's going to, I'll let her do an introduction, but it's going to be looking at kind of how we apply research into the management of soils. And then we've got Philip Wright, who's going to come in after that. And Philip's an independent consultant on kind of cultivations and soil management, and going to look a bit more at the practical sides of how we implement these this on farm using both kind of roots and cover crops and things like that, as well as cultivations itself. So I'm going to pass over to Jane now. Hopefully Jane will be able to share her slides with you. And like I say, yeah, any questions in the Q&A panel, and hopefully I'll be able to get Philip online. Okay, that's working for me, Jane, so I'll pass over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, Greg. Hello, everyone. Afternoon. Bear with me a second and I'll just get my presentation in front of me. This is already all very weird because I'm looking in this direction, but my slides are in that direction. So I'm afraid I can't see anybody. But again, just as Greg said, if you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. And I'd be happy to take any questions at the end. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jane Rickson, as Greg has said. I'm Professor of Soil Erosion and Conservation at Cranfield University. I've worked in applied soil science now for over 30 years, man and boy. And I'd just like to share over the next 15-20 minutes or so some of the research that we carry out, trying to make it have as much impact as possible, that we're not just in our academic ivory towers, but we do get out into the field, we do get our hands dirty and our boots dirty, And working with farmers and growers is the way that we carry out our research. And I'm going to give you some projects that illustrate the work and how we go about our research. We hear a lot about improving soil health. Soil health is very trendy at the moment. Everybody's talking about soil health. And again, I want to give some background as to, well, what do we mean by soil health? I think there are as many definitions of soil health as there are soil scientists out there. So I'm going to give a go at actually defining what we mean by soil health. But more importantly, again, how do we manage soil health? How do we improve it? How do we avoid losing soil health by degrading our soils? So that's really the background that I want to put here. I see that Greg had on one of his slides that it is the International Year of the Soil back in 2015. Well, it went so well that they then extended it to be the International Decade of the Soils. So we've got a whole decade, and my mission is to make sure that we have a centenary or even millennium of soils as important as they are. And I'm sure many of you, when you did soil science, when you studied soil science, those of you that did, they were probably the most boring lectures that you had. And again, my mission is to try and make soils exciting, and I'm passionate about soils, and I never want anybody to say soils are boring, they were the worst things I ever studied. So that's my background really. Okay, hopefully the slides are moving on. So what I'm going to be covering is basically the importance of soils and soil health, and then try and define what we mean by soil health, because we as managers and farmers and growers, our job is basically to ensure that we've got healthy soils to deliver all of those ecosystems, goods and services that Greg mentioned. And then I'm going to talk about our soil management research, some possible future soil management research. I'm going to try and relate how important soil management is with the up and coming ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, what sort of payments are going to be out there for good soil management, what sort of actions are going to be rewarded. The pilot sustainable farming incentive initiatives are coming out fairly soon to take over from the tests and trials. What sort of actions are likely to be rewarded as far as soil management is concerned? And then if you've all fallen asleep because you've had a fantastic lunch, then hopefully I'll wake you up with some take-home messages right at the end. So let's first of all talk about soils in the round. Greg's already mentioned how important they are, but I think it's even more fundamental than what he was saying, and that a lot of policy, right from the top, is trying to relate environmental agricultural policies with these UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is very high level stuff, but I think it demonstrates the drivers behind why soils are so important. And if you look at those UN Sustainable Development Goals, they basically demonstrate that we as the planet has got to try and achieve these goals to be sustainable and to continue in a prosperous way. And if you look at a lot of these, they are related to soils, things like no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, where do we get our healthy food from? All of these, a lot of these can be related to soils. And it's not just me saying that, and with bee in my bonnet. This is some work that was actually done by an international organisation back in 2018 that related each one of the Sustainable Development Goals to land and soil degradation. And they could then relate each of these, achievements, these targets, to how we look after our soils and how we look after our land. So fundamentally, it is saying that this is a global issue and we need to look after our soils. So healthy soils, as I've tried to demonstrate, are part of our natural capital, delivering these multiple ecosystems, goods and services. And they have direct links with sustainability, our economic, our environmental and social pillars of sustainability. And soils are ultimately related to human health and well-being. If you think what you had for your breakfast this morning, 97% of our food comes from the terrestrial environment, from soils. And so, yes, there's always going to be people that have had salmon for breakfast, but they're very posh. But most people, if you look at your breakfast or your lunch, 97% of that will come from soil. So very, very important. And again, soils are so important. I will come on to specific soil management in a minute, but look what we get out of the soils. And again, this is another way of expressing that visual, that image that Greg showed. that we get provisioning of food, fibre, fodder and fuel. I like that alliteration. But other things that soils provide us, they provide us with water storage and water supply. They provide us with land for development. You know, we hear in the Queen's speech just yesterday about, you know, build, and, you know, recovery and so on and so forth. We need some land for that development. Of course, that puts agricultural land under huge pressure, but we do need that land. And then we have regulation of ecosystem service processes, things like water storage and release. I'll say a little bit about how important soils are for water storage in a minute, but also carbon storage, the ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through the cover crops that we're growing, through the crops themselves, which helps to mitigate climate change. And things that we often don't talk about in soils, which I think are really, really interesting, is the sort of cultural stuff that we get from soils. This concept of our green and pleasant land comes from how we manage our soils. You know, anybody that arrives back, you know, flying to Heathrow from holiday or work or whatever, not that many of us are doing that right now, of course, you know, that green and pleasant land that we know and love, that is related to how we manage our soils. And we get our recreation, you know, even football and golf and all of this depends on how we manage our soils, and protection of heritage through archaeology and so on and so forth. And then we've got the supporting services like habitats and biodiversity and so on. So I'm really, you know, as you can see, I'm a real advocate for soils and how precious they are, how important they are. And we as practitioners, farmers, growers, soil scientists, whatever your role might be, has a role in making sure our soils are fit for purpose. And I love this this quote, and forgive me for those of you that have already known this, but I think this sort of encaptures what I'm trying to say about how important soils are. The thin layer of soil covering the Earth's surface represents the difference between survival and extinction for most terrestrial life. So the old adage, you know, it's not really a matter of life and death. Well, according to this quote, yes, it is. It is that important. All right, so forgive me if I go back to sort of school level, you know, well, what is soil? And I am depressed by how few university courses, agricultural courses, environmental courses actually cover soils in any sort of detail. And, you know, there's all sorts of reasons that I'm not going to go into now, but many people working even in agriculture and environment have very, very little understanding the fundamentals of soil. Many are experts, but I'm just going to go back to basics here. And I think this is something that Philip will pick up as well, that let's have a look at what we're actually talking about. What is soil? It's not just that brown muck. It's not dirt, as many people call it. But it is a composition of lots of different components. So we've got the mineral content, the texture, the soil texture, the clays, the silts and the sands. They make up about 45% of that handful of soil that you might be picking up on farm. And that relates to its geology, of course, and the chemical composition. Now, in an ideal world, we'd want about 25% of that handful of soil to be made up of air. Another 25% may be made up of water. A good 5% of organic matter content, if you can find it. Many of our arable soils are much lower than that. And that's going to be where your humus and where your living roots and your soil organisms, your microorganisms, your macroorganisms, all of that biology, that soil biology is living within that 5% or so. And, you know, that's what we should be aiming for when we're carrying out soil management practices. That, if you like, is the ideal components of the soil. And those are all arranged physically in what we know as soil structure. And lots of people bang on about soil structure and how important it is. And I totally agree with them. Problem is we can't put a number on soil structure. It's not like pH or organic matter. It doesn't have a number, but it's so important. It allows the roots to grow. It allows movement of air and water and soil organisms. And obviously it affects things like soil strength and your loading capacity, which is really important in resisting compaction, which I know Philip will be talking about later. So, as I say, lots of people really hang their hat on soil structure and how important it is. And again, well, what does that mean for us who are managing soils? How can we use that information? And I think if you think about soil structure, you need to understand that soils are made up of lots of soil aggregates or clods or PEDs or whatever you want to call them. And their size distribution is really important because that affects the pores in between those. Now, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the size of these aggregates will also determine the size of the voids or the pores between those aggregates. So here's my aggregate, one aggregate which ranges from 1 millimetre up to maybe 10 millimetres, and how they all fit together in your soil profile will also affect the size of the pores that are created between those aggregates. And we have macro pores, they're the big pores that allow easy drainage. That might be a good thing, you want to get rid of the water. It might be a bad thing, you want to hold on to the water. So that depends on whether you're trying to shift water through the profile or you want to hang on to it. But if we had only macro pores, only very chunky soils, then that's not a great seed bed. That's going to give you poor crop establishment and maybe even crop lodging once you've got a crop growing. Then we have the medium-sized pores, the mesopores. These are able to store water, to hold water, which is helpful during times of drought. And let's face it, we've had it incredibly dry over April. It's been so dry. So if our soils can hold on to a little bit more of that water, that's going to help us. But they're also large enough that we can drain some of that water if we have too much water as well. So they're pretty useful to have. And the water within those mesopores is available to the crops. But then we have the micropores, those tiny little pores in between the smaller aggregates. And then we get into some trouble because the water is quite difficult to extract by the crops. They can't actually pull it up through their roots. And we're going to have less air and water movement. And what we're after in soil management is very simple. It's going back to the 3 R's. And it's not writing, reading and arithmetic. It's actually, we want well-structured soils that have a mixture of these macro, meso and micropores so that they can receive water when it rains. When it rains, they can actually receive that water. They can retain that water within these mesopores, but they can also release water to avoid the waterlogging, which can lead to compaction problems because we're going onto the soil when it's just too wet. So hopefully these sort of principles will be picked up in Philip's talk in a minute. Right, I need to move on. I'm waffling on as usual, so apologies. I'm waffling on, so I'll carry on. What is soil health, soil quality? As I say, there's probably as many definitions out there as there are soil scientists. But I think my take-home point here is that soil health or soil quality is this capacity of soil to function, to do what you want it to do, whether you want it to grow 20 tons of wheat, or whether you want it to act as a wetland habitat, or whether you want it to be a foundation for a new high-speed rail link, whatever it might be, that soil is able to function in that way. And that soil health or soil quality is dependent first on the soil properties. And this is where we need to understand what soil properties are really important. So for example, I've mentioned soil porosity. That's important because it affects those soil processes or functions that are going on in the soil, things like infiltration of rainfall. And that in turn is important because it determines these goods and services that Greg mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and how those goods and services are delivered. So my example here is that soil properties affect things like soil porosity. Porosity then affects the infiltration of rainfall. And the infiltration of rainfall will then affect flood control. If we're infiltrating those storm events, we will have lower intensity flooding events. They won't stop completely, but we'll take the edge off those flooding events. And here we have Tewkesbury back in 2007, I think it was, that they had this massive flooding because of the way the soils were managed up in the catchment. So again, a lot of people say, well, what is soil health? How can we measure it? There are thousands of different soil properties because soil is very, very complex. And a bit like Desert Island Disc, when you can only choose 8 records, I think if you had to only choose 5 indicators of soil health, these 5 are pretty good indicators of how healthy your soil is. And I acknowledge my colleague, Professor Carl Ritz, with coming up with this genius graphic to illustrate not only those 5 important characteristics: organic matter, the water or airspace, the structure of the soil, the nutrient content, and the soil biology, your earthworms and microorganisms and so on. I think the genius thing about this graphic is how everything is interrelated. You take one of those things away, for example, soil biology, and you start to see how the house of cards falls down, because everything is interrelated. So again, take-home messages: if you could only have 5 indicators of soil health, I think these 5 are a pretty good starting point. Right, I'll very, very quickly now talk about some of our soil management research. Greg, I can't see you, so if you're waving frantically to say shut up, you've gone over your time, I can't see you, so I'm just going to continue. I have noticed what the time is, so I will wrap up hopefully in time. Anyway, what are we trying to do with our soil management research? Well, it's very simple: 1, 2, 3. One is soil health management needs to enhance productivity, the quantity, the quality, and the reliability of our yields. It's not just about quantity, it's about the quality of those yields as well. At the same time, we need to control soil degradation. We don't want to have massive yields if that's going to really, technical term, bugger up our soils. So we need to prevent soil erosion and compaction and losses of organic matter and so on. So we need to control soil degradation. And if you think about it, if you can enhance productivity and control soil degradation at the same time, you've basically got this concept of sustainable intensification, where you produce more but with less environmental impact or damage. And I'm just going to give you 3 examples of some projects that we've run at Cranfield. They're just examples of some of the research that we do in this area of soil and water management. You'll see there I've bulleted some of the work we do on cultivations and tillage practices, which I'll present today. But we also do stuff on cover cropping, soil amendments, field engineering layout, soil erosion products as well. And if any of those are of interest, I'm happy to take any questions, or please feel free to contact me afterwards. So the first project I want to mention was a project that we did with a very large consortium led by Syngenta. Had 2 sites, one at the Alliston project up in Leicestershire at Loddington, the other one down in Somerset on National Trust land. And here we were looking at different intensities of cultivation and the impact it had on things like, yes, the crop agronomy, but also soil protection, erosion rates. We looked at tillage intensity on biodiversity, the water quality that was coming off those fields, and we also did an economic analysis. We had a conventional treatment practice where we did conventional tillage. We had a minimum tillage practice in the middle then, known as the SOWUP practice. And then we had a farmer's preference, which was kind of a combination of the 2. Farmer was a bit reluctant to go completely minimum till, but he said, OK, well, I'll take the gas off a little bit and I'll reduce the intensities of the cultivations. And as I say, we assessed lots of different parameters by looking at these different intensities of cultivation. Here I've shown you some examples of the earthworm numbers, and you'll see generally this is the temperatures at which we were taking the soil temperatures at which we were taking the earthworms. And you'll see, generally speaking, the conservation till plots gave us higher number of earthworms. You can understand that because there's been less soil disturbance where those earthworm numbers might be damaged. So we all know that the earthworm is a great indicator of soil health, and we provided the evidence to show that reducing the intensity of that cultivation helped improve earthworm numbers and associated soil health. We were also able to show that reducing cultivation intensity also reduced soil losses and runoff losses and nutrient losses within that runoff. So again, demonstrating that intensity of cultivation does have an effect on soil degradation. The second project I'd like to mention is one that was done by Dr. Mike Giannopoulos. I can never pronounce his name. He allowed us to call him Mike the Greek. So I know that's not very PC, but he was happy for us to call him Mike the Greek because I couldn't pronounce his surname. My bad entirely. Now, he was looking at, even within conservation tillage, minimum till systems, you've got different intensities of tillage. So not only is it between conventional and conservation, it's also within conservation what sort of different bits of kit might affect tillage and therefore would affect these soil health indicators. And Mike came up with, again, evidence to demonstrate that things like organic carbon and earthworm populations were significantly affected by different types of min-till kit based on the geometry and the mode of operation. Again, that was related to soil health. And the final project was on strip till, which is the ultimate, combination of till versus no-till within the same field. And this is what was done by Ian Dummett, looking at, first of all, to what extent did tillage reduce soil biology, how much damage was done to things like fungi, bacteria, earthworms, which we know are very important. Does the soil biology recover nearer the untilled plot? So where you haven't disturbed the soil, does the biology that's living happily there then start to commute or migrate into the till plot to bring back that biology? And this was basically the hypothesis behind Ian's work. I think I've got a video that shows some of the work that we did in our soil bin to look at the extent to which that different bit of kit disturbed the soil surface. So with any luck, this may work. It seems to be working. I've no idea whether it's whether you can see it as well, but this is some kit. This is the strip till, the strip cat bit of machinery. And Ian was looking the degree of the disturbance, despite having the flanking discs and so on, that was caused by that bit of kit. And not surprisingly, we found that where you've got tillage, your microbial biomass, your fungi is lower, but where you have no tillage, you've got a higher population of that biology. And here with strip tillage, if you like, we've got the best of both worlds. Yes, we've got a fine seed bed for our crop growth, but we've got this undisturbed area, and the biology within that undisturbed area can start to repopulate that tilled area after tillage to start getting the nutrient cycling and the organic matter back into that strip row. All right, I've gone over, and I apologise for that. Very quickly, take-home messages. We've got to increase food production by 3% per annum on finite land resources. Healthy soils can develop and can deliver multiple goods and services, and soil management can improve that. But the cost effectiveness of these practices is going to be very site specific and is going to be related to the socio-economic context. It's not just all about technical performance, but it's about how much support is there for these practices. And I just want to leave you with a positive thought. Some of you will know that the basic farm payment is going to be replaced by the Environmental Land Management Scheme by DEFRA. And they've got this Sustainable Farming Incentive Scheme, which is kicking off this year. And it's being piloted at the moment. And within that, there's a number of standards that farmers and growers will have to demonstrate. This is all at pilot scale, so it's not set in stone. And I've given you a link there so you can read up about this. But I was encouraged to see that the actions that will be rewarded or hope to be rewarded include a lot about soil management, improve soil structure and biology, reducing tillage depth, reducing tillage. So there's a lot of support for some of these practices, changing our practices, not radically, but gently. And hopefully those will be rewarded within this new DEFRA ELM scheme. But we have to wait and see how the pilots go. So in conclusion, the challenge for global agriculture is to grow more food on not much more land, using less water, fertilizer and pesticides than we have historically done. And I would argue that the answer is entirely well, not entirely, but is certainly within how we manage those soils. So with that, I will stop and apologise for going over, and happy to take questions at the end.
Thanks, Jane. Sorry, I was just on mute there as I was trying to talk. I'm just going to share my screen again quickly, and then we'll I can let you all know where we are. So unfortunately, we're still having some technical issues getting Philip, our second speaker. So I'm really appreciative to Jane for running over a little bit, which is
well, it was all planned, wasn't it, Greg? To
exactly.
be honest, we planned it from the beginning. Now you tell me I could have gone even longer.
I know, exactly. So the technical issues that we have, we thought we'd resolved it with Teams, but yeah, we've had this issue in the past, and we can't seem to resolve it with Philip, unfortunately. So what we're going to do, I've asked Phil to try and have one kind of final last go at logging in. So we're just going to go through a couple of questions based on your presentation, Jane, and then we can kind of see if Phil's is here, and if not, we'll have to wrap up and have a slightly shorter session. But the first one is someone has asked, kind of, in the UK, what do you think the greatest factor that causes soil degradation currently is?
So we did a study for DEFRA looking at the costs of soil degradation, the total costs of soil degradation. And of the data that's there, and there's a lot of data that isn't there, it is compaction. I think compaction is the biggest issue. Certainly the costs of compaction in terms of the flooding associated with compaction, possibly having to re-drill or recultivate or even subsoil, all of these costs have a huge impact on farmers, individual farmers, and farming and agriculture as a whole. So I would say, if I had to choose one, even though I'm a soil erosion geek, and I'd love to say soil erosion is more important than anything else, frankly, I think it is compaction. And the challenge with compaction is that it is so weather dependent. The rainfall, when we get the rainfall, how much rainfall we get is a very important factor. But frankly, also what we've done to the soils prior to that rainfall is also important. Because if you can get that rainfall, remember it goes back to the 3 hours, 3 hours, I can't say that, 3 hours. If you can make your soil that it can receive that rainfall and drain that rainfall quickly, so you don't get over wet soils, then you can go on quicker without causing that compaction. The problem is a lot of people are forced to go onto the land when it's just too wet because they've got to get that crop out or they've got to get that crop in. And that's where we're seeing the compaction. And yes, it is a trick of nature as to when it rains, but if your soils are in good nick before it rains, hopefully you'll get some of that excess water away. And so your soils will start to dry out and you can get on quicker.
I completely kind of agree with that. And the other thing is over the last few years, we've seen probably more extreme weather patterns, which means that it's kind of working against us a bit. So kind of even to stay still, getting that improved drainage of the water through the soil profile, even just to kind of still have the same number of workable days is important. So an increasing challenge.
Yeah.
I
agree. Oh, sorry, go on. No, I'll shut up. Go on.
I was going to say a slightly more. You spoke a lot about aggregates or pods there, but what holds an aggregate together is one question we've had.
Very good. So an aggregate, the really important thing with aggregate is the organic matter content. That's really like the glue, if you like. And so it's a combination of organic matter. It's also but soil biology is really, really important. So things like fungi actually spread their hyphae out between the soil particles, bringing them all together, again, acting as a glue. So I would say it's definitely about the organic matter and the attraction of the organic matter and that mineral content. It's about the soil biology, spreading these thread-like structures through the aggregate, sticking it all together. And then it's also chemistry as well. And there's not a lot there is a lot you can do about chemistry, but certainly in terms of the chemical bonds within that aggregate, which might be a function of the chemistry of the particles. But what you certainly can do is ensure you've got the biology there that sticks to things together and the organic matter. You're not losing that, you're adding to those. And that will help stick or glue your aggregates together.
And we've had another question that's looking at kind of crop residues. And the question says, if you remove crop residues every year, how long does it take for soil to be, they said buggered, but soils to become unproductive, say. But I want to just a little twist on that question is, do you think you can remove crop residues? Say, for example, where I used to work in Derbyshire, everyone baled kind of every acre of straw generally because of the demand for livestock farms. Do you think you can do that and still develop kind of resilient and healthy soils, or do you think kind of reincorporating crop residues is essential?
I think yes. So, apologies if I've offended anybody by that technical term that I used earlier on. Apologies. You'll have to bleep that out when you make the recording or something. I think it's just a simple equation of input versus output. And if you're taking out more than you're putting in, then that means you've got a system in decline. And so although you might keep the root component of the crop, again, I think if you're taking more organic matter out than you're putting back into the soil, then there will be a deficit of organic matter within the soil. And again, going back to that those five indicators, it wasn't fortuitous that organic matter content is right at the top of that five indicators of soil health, because I would say that is the most important driver of all those other indicators. So I think if you want to take crop residue, that's fine, but you need to then replace it with other organic amendments. And it's interesting you were saying that when crop residue was taken off the land, it was to feed the livestock industry. And there we're talking about a mixed farming system whereby the livestock would then be part of that field. They would probably go onto the land, you know, in a rotation, obviously. It would be put down to grass for a while. There would be manure added, farmyard manure, and so on and so forth. So that's a kind of a mixed farming system, which might well be imbalanced because of going inputs, outputs. But I think where we're going wholly arable, it is trying to maintain that level of organic matter. If you're taking all the crop residues away, how are you going to replace that organic matter?
I completely agree. And kind of from my experience, I used to work in, like I say, I used to be working Derbyshire, and we had some fantastic kind of sustainable farming systems where there was kind of a combination of root crops, forage crops with sheep on them, farmyard manure, mixed beef and sheep farms that kind of even inadvertently were kind of doing all the right things to promote soil health. Quite a traditional way of farming, which actually worked fantastically. So it was interesting to see. Yeah, I've got two more questions. I want to see if Philip's. I'm going to ask two more questions because I don't want to grill you too much, because I know you're facing them kind of on your own a bit. So, second to last one is going to be, when do you think carbon credits will be introduced into the UK?
Oh, I'm afraid I don't know. I don't know. There was a very good webinar a couple of days ago about carbon credits. I think LEAF, Linking Environment and Farming, they're very in the know with carbon credits. So I'm afraid it's not my area, and I can't give you an answer to that. Apologies. But I know a man who can. So have a look at with LEAF, and I'm sure people within Basis might. Greg, you might even know the answer. She says, pushing it aside. Did you see what I did there? Yeah, you were.
Well, I think you can. I think there is a way now, if you want to sell carbon credits from kind of increasing organic matter in your soils, then I think there is ways to do it even now. And there are companies out there. And actually, if you read, I think it was last week's Farmers Weekly, there was a really interesting article about it and about kind of looking at carbon credits and how not to take anyone's. So read the article, because I don't want to take anyone's credit for the input.
Boom, boom. Very good.
But they spoke about how sustainable is it once you've kind of sold that carbon. Whose kind of requirement is it then to maintain those organic matter levels? If the organic matter levels drop in the future, what happens in terms of the value of them? So it's And then I've got one final question. I think this is a really nice one to finish on. Is what is the lowest hanging fruit that you would suggest for a farmer to implement to improve their soil structure? So if you went onto a farm today and they were quite a conventional farm, what's the easiest thing they can do to kind of start on that journey to improving soil management?
It's a very, very good question. And of course, every farm, every field is different. I would honestly say know what the challenges are first. I know that's not really the answer you want, But I would work with a farmer and say, what are your issues? What are the challenges? That's the first step. No, I won't say problem because that's not the right word, but know what the challenges are. You know, where are the problem fields? What's happening in those fields? Basically, I would dig a hole and I would have a look at the soil in that hole on those challenging fields and try and work out what the issue is before coming up with any blanket panacea of how we're going to suddenly increase organic matter content to 7% or whatever we might aspire to do. So I know that's not the answer. You want me to say, well, it would be to use cover crops, or it would be to go down the min-till route. I'm not going to do that, because I think you need to know what the challenge is on every single farm, every single field, by talking to the farmer and understand what their perceptions of the issues are. So that's a bit of a lily-livered answer, but that genuinely is what I do. Know what the challenges are first.
I would agree on that. I think a lot of people kind of have increase in organic matter, or like you say, manures or cover crops, as they're thinking, oh, that's the thing to do. But you can go onto farms with very high organic matter, yes, and it doesn't mean the soil is always in fantastic health. They could have other issues with wind erosion or soil erosion or compaction, and again, the other way around. You could go onto farms that have got a fantastic kind of cultivation strategy, but kind of the nutrient balance within the soils is difficult, or the drainage isn't right, or something like that. So yeah, there's doing that assessment, I think is definitely the right way to go. And that's linked in well to the soil and water course I spoke about at the start. We've kind of focused on soil assessments and soil plans and soil management as a key part of that course. Now, I'm still having some issues getting Phil on, so if Philip can hear me, we're ever so sorry about the technical issues. I don't know what's happened. I thought Teams had resolved. We have had this in the past, and I thought Teams had resolved it, but it evidently hasn't. I really appreciate, Jane, the time you spent. I think we've pretty much filled the time anyway with your presentation and some really good questions. So I'd also like to say thanks to everyone who participated and put questions in. I think that's been a really great session. This will be recorded, and all Philip's slides will be put onto a Basis News article, so you can access the slides and have a look at what he was going to talk about in terms of cultivations and compaction. And hopefully we'll be able to have Philip back another time, maybe on a podcast or a webinar in the future. So thanks again, everyone, for attending. Oh, and yeah, this will be recorded. Someone did ask, oh, will this be recorded? Yeah, as with all Basis webinars, this will go on YouTube afterwards. There'll be a link in the news article, and you'll be able to access everything from there. And yeah, if you've put your 200 number into the Q&A box, or you've registered with your 200 number and logged in kind of with the same email address, then your points for 1 point for attending this webinar will be added onto your account in the next few days as we get towards the end of the membership year. So hopefully a few people have racked up a few points to get to that final total by the end of May. So thanks again, and thanks, Jane, and yeah, we'll see you on the next webinar.
Thanks, Greg. Bye, everyone.